Hi everyone, welcome to this series of video lectures for the Digital Hermeneutics course at UC Berkeley. My name is Tom and I'll be your instructor for this course, which is about the theory and practice of interpretation in an age of big data. Today's introduction to the course will be about one of the main problems that the humanities face. And that's the problem of generating legitimate scientific knowledge. We'll look at two concepts from philosophy related to this problem, namely epistemology and ontology. Throughout this course, we will view the digital humanities as a field that's offering a response to this problem of knowledge. And we will think about how the digital humanities are embedded in the humanistic tradition, but also how they diverge from it. And we will ask ourselves which parts of that tradition are actually valuable to remember and maintain. I think that's important because when you start using digital tools and working with big data, it might be tempting not to think about these issues anymore, for reasons that we'll get to. To put it more simply, this course is an attempt to emphasize the humanities in the digital humanities. A little bit about myself first. My PhD thesis was in culture studies and it focused on travel writing in the digital age. I wanted to look at non-canonical writings, that is, writings by people from all over the world who are posting about their travels online. And my contention was that they do so in all sorts of genres, and that includes genres that you might not traditionally associate with travel writing. Things like the travel review that you find on websites like TripAdvisor or Airbnb. So I started reading these reviews, and after 6 months or so of doing that, I wanted to jump off a cliff. They were all so similar, and there was hardly any stylistic difference between them. They were just not very interesting to read, especially not that many of them. Still, they were very interesting for other reasons. People were talking a lot about things like identity and authenticity, things that I was interested in. So I wondered how to go about it, how to investigate all these narratives. And I started using distant reading tools, things like topic modeling, word embeddings methods, and so on, in order to find structure in what I was seeing. And I try to combine those findings with the typical forms of close reading that I had been taught during my years as a grad student in culture studies. Currently, I am a research associate in algorithmic discrimination at the Department of Informatics at King's College London. Here you see our campus on the Thames. And my research is revolving especially around issues of interpretability. Our modern world is, as you will know, built on computational systems, and these systems generate decisions that we, as humans, have to interpret somehow. We often take these decisions to be authoritative, precisely because they are computational and not human. But the thing is, how humans and machines interpret things is fundamentally different, and this is especially relevant in a context of AI. Of machine learning and neural networks and so on. Simply put, computers understand things that people don't, and the other way around as well. Now, this interest of mine in interpretation is also why we are here today. Over the next 6 weeks, we are going to look at the continental tradition of hermeneutics in the context of big data and the digital humanities. So, we're basically confronting the digital humanities with this tradition of hermeneutics. The course is built on two pillars. In the first 2 sessions of each week, on Monday and Tuesday, we will discuss key debates and theories on hermeneutics, and we'll look at what a hermeneutic point of view might teach us about the digital humanities and the methods used there. In the second 2 sessions of each week, on Wednesday and Thursday, we will apply computational methods driven by hermeneutically oriented research questions. We will mainly use Python, and even if you have no experience in coding in Python, you are very much invited to join and learn the language. I will be using Jupyter notebooks every week. Basically, these are documents that contain code that you can execute, but also visualizations and narrative text, explanations basically for what you have to do. And of course, you can always ask questions to your more advanced co-students or to me. Now, those of you who still feel uneasy with the idea of learning how to code will be able to use graphical tools for this, but please keep in mind that they are much more simplistic than the kinds of things you can program if you know even a little bit of coding. So again, there's a good reason for trying to do so. I'd like to start with a little scenario. For those of you that are in the humanities and social sciences, it might be recognizable. So imagine you're at a family party because your niece has turned 4, and all is going perfectly well. It's a great party until a little later in the afternoon, that one uncle comes up to you while you're minding your own business. And you can tell from the look on his face that he's had something to drink and he's clearly in the mood to argue. And he says, "I heard you're in the humanities. How is that even a science? You just analyze some literature and that's it. You don't have hypotheses, you don't have clear methods. Why does my tax money even pay for this pseudo-scientific nonsense?" And so on and so forth. How do you respond? Now, I'd just like to know, how do you respond? Has anyone ever been in a situation like this one? Maybe it was a skeptical uncle, or maybe it was a friend studying physics. Maybe it was someone online. Anyway, if you go to our course website, you'll be able to give your own example here. I'm very curious to hear if you have any. I'm just offering this little vignette because it stems from a series of ideologies about what science is. And it is important, I think, to discuss the digital humanities using computational tools to deal with issues of human culture as a response to this issue. I think if you want to be a digital humanities scholar, you need to deal with these assumptions about what correct scientific methods are, how we can consider them. So today, I want to talk a little bit more about these foundational assumptions and ideologies about science. One way of answering your uncle might be to say, well, in the humanities we are interested in different aspects of human society and culture. Okay, well, what is culture? And then it turns out that there's a few different ways of thinking about culture. They're often used interchangeably, which adds to confusion about the term, but it might be good to try and disentangle them. The first one is culture is intellectual, creative, spiritual, or aesthetic development. If you call your drunk uncle at the party an uncultured swine, this is what you mean, right? He doesn't carry out his intellectual capacity to understand the humanities. More broadly, you could, for instance, speak about the cultural development of Western Europe. And you would be referring to the intellectual and spiritual and aesthetic factors, right? Great philosophers, great artists, great poets, and so on. Second, culture is a form of life. If you tell your friend who asked how the party was yesterday of your niece that there was this toxic culture of mansplaining going on, this is what you mean. It's not about intellectual and aesthetic factors here, it's about societally determined forms of behavior. And again, this goes in general, where culture can refer to things like holidays, sports, festivals, and so on. This is the kind of stuff that anthropologists typically are interested in. Third, Culture can refer to something more specific, namely kinds of creative endeavors, music, TV, paintings, and so on. If you ask someone, do you like popular culture? This is usually what you'll be referring to. You're talking about the products of a certain culture. So those three components here, they lead to one answer to what it is that people in the humanities are doing. They look at art, they look at behavior, at norms and values and rituals and religions, the formation of ideas, and so on. Another answer that you could give your skeptical uncle is to tell them what the field of the humanities actually does. This here is the answer Wikipedia will give you. Humanities are academic disciplines that study aspects of human society and culture. Okay, so that seems straightforward, but studying aspects of society, so does economy, so does law, so does sociology, fields that many people would classify as other fields than humanities. And in part, this goes to show how vague and blurry the lines between these disciplines are. Really, the thing to take away here is that it's not just about the kind of thing that people in the humanities study, it's about how they study it. And that is, of course, also what this course is about. There's all kinds of ways in which someone from the humanities gets to know the world. There's methods like aesthetic interpretation, or logical reasoning, or critical thinking, or close or distant reading, and so on. The question that this uncle of yours is asking is basically, how are these methods scientific? Now, the humanities in recent years have been receiving quite a lot of this kind of criticism. And it comes from different angles. Sometimes it comes from people within the hard sciences, such as mathematics and physics. People who make the point that the humanities and the soft sciences, as they're called, should just be stripped of that title of science. There's a joke among physicists that goes that any field of academic research that has the word science behind it is actually not a science. So where does that criticism come from? Well, for one, the soft sciences don't really follow the classic scientific method, which has characterized the natural sciences since pretty much the 17th century. This consists of systemic observation. This consists of systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. So this position that a scientist would take holds that the methods and results of science are not, and certainly should not, be influenced by personal interests or value commitments. Why? Well, they take away from a thing that is considered very important, and that is objectivity. Of course, this offers a very big problem for the humanities. Of course, this results in a very big problem for the humanities, because how can you study humans and their behavior and all the cultural stuff they produce in objectivistic terms? One way to parse this problem a little bit and to see how to respond to it is by considering the philosophy of knowledge and the kinds of premises that it's built on. First, there is the term ontology. It refers to the question, what can we actually assume about the nature and reality of this world that we live in? There are, roughly speaking, three positions that you could take, at least in the humanities, in this regard. The first one is that of objectivism, and that's the same paradigm that we were just talking about. A position that says that the phenomena that make up our world have an existence of their own, completely apart from and independent of any social actors, humans, who are involved. The second one, and the main antagonist to that first way of thinking, is called constructivism, or constructionism, based on where you're coming from. They mean the same thing. This is the position stating that the phenomena making up our world are only real in the sense that they are constructed ideas, right? Things in our head, things that are continuously being reviewed and reworked by those involved in them through social interaction and reflection. Then there is the third, which is critical realism, and this is a position that appeared after objectivism, and that maintains some aspects of it, but also incorporated a new degree of skepticism. It basically holds that the world has a reality that is separate from people involved in it, and that can be known, but always with a degree of uncertainty. It can be known through the senses and through the effects of hidden structures and mechanisms. So, what's epistemology then? Well, basically, as we said, it refers to theories about knowledge and what's called justified belief. So, it basically presents a view and a justification for what can be regarded as proper knowledge. And it asks, what can actually be known about this world? And what criteria must be satisfied in order for knowledge to be called, well, knowledge, and not just a belief? Positivism, first, is the epistemological position that we already talked about, which says that knowledge is based on what can be observed and recorded. So it's not about subjective understandings. This, of course, develops from the objectivist position that there is a social reality out there that is independent of the researcher. So what usually happens in the research process is a hypothesis is drawn up, quantitative data are collected, some aspects of the world are measured, and causal relationships between these different aspects of the world are then sought. And researchers might make use of big data sets or statistical analyses in order to come to certain repeatable and generalizable conclusions. The second position is that of interpretivism, and this is the epistemological position that does the exact opposite. It prioritizes people's subjective interpretations and actions. Because it's tied to the constructivist ontological position, research in this field is all about qualitative data, right? Such as interviews. Interviews are often rich in detail and description, and they're also often built on a certain empathetic understanding of how the people being interviewed see the world. Now, this understanding is necessary, an interpretivist would say, in order to uncover all kinds of subjective meanings and to interpret these meanings within a specific context. It's about finding the specifically unusual cases instead of those that are generalizable. Cases that upset your thinking about the world. Stuff that shows that things are happening that we didn't know were happening. This is why interpretivist researchers will often be interested in marginalized people, habits, cultures, and so on. They want to show that there's different ways of thinking in the world, and thereby give the world itself a better view on how it works. This position is often related to another term, which is that of anti-positivism. And what that word already hints at is that it goes against positivism. It says you can't actually know the world at all without having all kinds of pre-configured thoughts and concepts and values and so on that you bring to the equation. Critical realism, finally, is the epistemological approach that sort of stands in the middle between positivism and interpretivism. It says that knowledge of a phenomenon is based on both what can be observed, but also on all kinds of hidden structures and mechanisms whose effects can be observed. So the main aim of a critical realist is to identify both the hidden mechanisms and the observable effects. Note that this means that there is no way of certainly knowing what's informing these effects, right? What the world is actually made up of. It's a bit like Plato's cave, if you remember that allegory. We're only inferring things. And what the realist does is they typically try to reveal hidden structures and mechanisms, or uncover power relations or dominant ideologies and so on. The thing with these perspectives is, at some point, you're gonna need to make a choice. We all fall in a certain camp here, and it's good to ask yourself, which one do you think you're in? And not just that, but also ask some critical questions about why you actually think you're in that camp. And maybe put some pressure on your own ideas and preconceptions there. Now, let's move to a little example of the criticism on the humanities. Ever since the hard and soft sciences split up, and these different epistemological and ontological positions were developed, there's been a debate on the value of the soft sciences. How is what people in history or language or film studies are doing scientific, right? Every few decades or so, this discussion heats up again. Here's a famous example that took place during the so-called science wars in the 1990s. And that really sounds more spectacular than what it actually was, but okay. The example is that of Alan Sokal. And Sokal is a physicist, and he published an article in the then very famous postmodern journal Social Text. And his article was called "Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity." Now that sounds very lofty, but actually the whole article was a big hoax, and Sokal just cobbled together a bunch of nonsensical claims and ideas, and he pitched it to the journal, and lo and behold, the journal actually published it. So he went viral before going viral was a thing, and he has since then sort of dedicated his career to fighting postmodern thinking. He calls it fashionable nonsense. Fashionable because as long as you say the right things and you use the right words, the politically correct ones, so to say, you'll get published in the humanities. And if you've been following any of the sort of socio-political discussions in the last few years, you'll recognize that this is not just an issue of the 1990s. Sokal is not the only person who's this skeptical, and currently there are a lot of people out there like Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins and others sort of doing the same thing and using postmodern really as a swear word, saying that it's incredibly detrimental to the standards and development of proper science. Here's what Alan Sokal had to say about his position. Anyone who believes that the laws of physics are mere social conventions is invited to try transgressing those conventions from the windows of my apartment. I live on the 21st floor. Now, that's a funny quip, but it's less clear if anyone ever said that the laws of physics are social conventions. At least there's a whole range of critiques from the humanities that say, yes, the way in which we interpret a lot of scientific facts is a matter of social construction, but that's of course a completely different point. I don't think a lot of people will dispute, for instance, that Pluto, the planet out there, is real. There are not a lot of people who will say that there's not actually a mass floating in space there. Well, barring some extremist philosophers who would say that even what we call real is a convention. Or philosophers like Nick Bostrom, who would argue that there's a good chance we live in a simulation, so everything we call real is actually not. The point of social constructionism, however, is that when Pluto was no longer being classified as a planet, this had a lot of repercussions. The way in which we use words actually matters. It had repercussions on the funding of certain NASA projects or on the ways in which we imagine our solar system and so on. In other words, a lot of constructionist claims don't really care about whether the facts are objective. They care about what happens with these facts. So as you see, there are different responses to this challenge of scientism, as it's sometimes called. Some humanities scholars will tell you, well, sure, it might be impossible to be fully objective, but you should at least try your hardest to make sure any degree of subjectivity is removed from your analysis. A lot of the softer disciplines, and the humanities are an example, have in recent years become more quantifiable and more scientific. I think the digital humanities is a great example of that. Part of the reason why it's so popular is because it wants to confer a kind of missing legitimacy to the humanities in our computerized, digitized world. Other humanities scholars might say, well, that's a bit naive, because you can't really escape your subjectivity as a scholar. And this means you have to come to terms with it, to understand where it begins and ends, and how it informs your scope and the kinds of questions you ask. In fact, they might say that all of those calls to objectivity might be undermining the very heart of the discipline. Because here's the thing, most of the things that people in the humanities like talking about, people, art, behavior, attitudes, customs, rituals, ideas, they aren't precisely quantifiable or determinable. They're messy and complicated things, and this straitjacket of objectivity might just result in losing far more than you could gain. And yes, it's tempting to want things to be neat and tidy and to rely on all kinds of methods that give you determinate answers instead of drowning in this quagmire of nuance and incomplete knowledge. But in the end, no matter how meticulous you've been, history isn't a hard science, nor is literature or political science or ethics or linguistics. What I mean by that is these are fields that don't just want to explain the world by means of a set of universal laws. They want to understand the workings in the world, in all their particularities and eccentricities, things that are constantly changing, if only because the language we use to explain them is constantly changing. So this introduction was on ontology and epistemology and all kinds of criticisms on the humanities, but we haven't really talked about hermeneutics yet. And in the first week of the course, we're actually going to have a look at this study of interpretation itself and how it can help us navigate these epistemic concerns. I look forward to seeing you then.